So basically, trying to appease this particular client for work injury provided coverage for his 1099 drivers. And in that situation, the answer was yes. Yeah, sure. We could take those 10 drivers and we could place an OCAC policy standalone in place for them, no problem. When he went back to the client had flipped the script and said, no, 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 we don't want that. We want workers' compensation coverage instead. And that's where it started to get a little dicey because the expectation back from the client was, well, can't we just do the same thing? Take these 10 guys and, put them on a workers' comp policy and call it a day? Well, no, we can't, right? Because now
do they have more than 10 drivers?
They do.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, they have a larger network of drivers, maybe 50 or 60 of them, all independent contractors. And now it opens up the door. The minute we want to put together a workers' comp policy for that particular client, we have to address all of their labor force, not just the 10 running this particular route. And so that's where we run into the issue with this class of business when you want to talk about work injury coverage and the several different ways that you can go about it. And not everything out there is equal. You have third-party administrators that dabble in this in terms of offering this type of coverage. You have, standalone offerings from insurance providers known as a three-legged stool, workers' comp, occupational accident, contingent liability. So thought it was probably a good idea just to kind of jump into this today from an educational perspective and talk about this a little further as to why we couldn't put in place that workers' comp policy.
Yeah, the three-legged stool is super important, right? From two aspects, one from a coverage, one from a auditable standpoint. I had an account probably about 10 years ago that was faced with a significant workers' comp audit because they had a workers' comp policy on just their clerical and W-2 employees and had a network of 700 or 800 independent contractors driving around without work-related injury protection. So when it came time for an audit, they said, well, who are all, where's your revenue stream coming from? They said, well, all these independent contractor drivers. Well, where's their evidence of workers' compensation? They didn't have any. So in the eyes of the insurance company, they are considered an uninsured subcontractor, in which case the workers' comp carrier has the legal right to go after the premium on the uninsured subcontractors. Now, you're not using their full remuneration or full 1099 settlement, as they would, in payroll. You're using 1/3, but they do have the ability to go back, I believe, in 3 years in majority of states for the uncollected premium. That created a sizable 6-figure audit situation, in which case there was a settlement that was agreed upon between the two parties. But my point is, had they had the three-legged stool, which consists of workers' comp, occupational accident, and contingent liability with the same carrier, they would not have had that audit scenario take place.
So let me ask something quick though, because you say audit, and then we hear audit a lot in our world, but we talking like an audit like a GL carrier or a cargo carrier may do sometimes, especially if you leave them? Or is it like, hey, we have the right to audit, but we don't always audit? What workers' comp approach is what?
Workers' comp approach is an annual audit.
We are going to audit you every single policy term.
Correct. Now, the magnitude of the audit changes, right? Oftentimes it might be just you fill it in your year-end numbers and then you pay the difference or get the difference back in a return. There's also on-site audits where they actually dig through your payroll books and ask questions. That's what happened in this case. So, on smaller exposures, oftentimes what we're dealing with in the final mile industry, usually the W-2 exposure is clerical sales, maybe some warehouse, not typically heavy driver focused.
But what's the number one argument we hear back, right? But they're 1099s. They're responsible for their own workers' comp, right? So how come that doesn't hold up?
Well, the problem and the reason why it doesn't hold up is because if that individual were involved in an accident and hurt on the job, and then they hire, their neighbor's an attorney, and says, I want to file for reclassification, be deemed an employee so I can collect on workers' compensation, then you're fighting that whole battle, and the person that's funding that battle is the workers' comp carrier. So
Well, and workers' comp statutes in every state basically say, hey, look, this is a state like law.
correct.
If they say they're an employee and they're injured, the policy is going to start paying. We'll
Yeah.
figure it out after the fact. So
Correct.
you're trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube right after it gets all squished out, which is never really a smooth or easy process, right? So
Right.
you can see from the insurer side, the workers' comp insurer side, hey, we want to flesh all this out as quickly as possible so we know what we're dealing with, what our exposure is, all that kind of good stuff, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that was going to be my question too, Judge, was, what's the threat to the workers' comp insurer? Why do they care? And so ultimately you've got these potentially uninsured subcontractors that can file a work injury claim against the workers' comp provider. But it even goes, above and beyond that as well, from the perspective that you could have an occupational accident policy in place and still not have this done correctly, right? Because
Right.
OCGAC is not a form of state mandated work injury type coverage that's recognized by the state or the workers' comp insurers, right? So if you're going to do this correctly, it needs to be done in the form of some type of program. And Brian mentioned the three-legged stool, workers' comp coverage for the W-2 personnel at the delivery company, the admin, the clerical, the warehouse personnel, the occupational accident insurance for the 1099s in the event that they get hurt, while performing delivery duties for that particular company, and then contingent liability that sits in between in the event that a 1099 driver were to, pursue work to get reclassified as an employee for work comp coverage, because it happens, right? You could have OCGAC in place and the guy's not happy enough because it's not state mandated coverage. If he is, permanently disabled, can no longer work ever again, that occupational accident coverage is going to run out at some point in time.
Yeah,
so
what we always say, right, is occupational accident is not workers' comp.
That's
If
right.
you think about it, right, the best way you can think about it is occupational accident coverage is work injury coverage with very defined benefits for a very defined period of time. So when we say
And
defined,
limit.
yeah, we mean skinny down limit, skinny down time versus what statutory comp benefits are based on the state matrix of injury and length of injury and severity of injury. So
That's exactly right. So I mean, in that situation where you have a driver who's not satisfied with the situation or payments because of his injury being so significant, they can still pursue the delivery company for benefits as an employee. And that's what triggers the contingent liability. And that's when you get back to my example with this particular client and his questions as it relates to just putting OCGAC over those drivers. The answer was yes when it was just OCGAC. But the minute you put that workers' comp carrier into the mix and their robust coverage, right, it's a problem. You can't
Right.
just, do it for a select portion of the exposure. You need to do it across the line, and you need to advise your insurance broker everything you have your hands within so that they make sure it's done correctly to protect you from the threat of audit.
And I'll just make another comment too, is if you're bringing on any freight broker or brokering any loads, you better verify that you've got a proof of workers' compensation on your COI if you are to broker a load, because that could be picked up from an audit perspective as well.